the the West African tradition, specifically that of Sheikh Uthman and Fodi, is very important for a discussion on liberation theology. And so the constituents, as far as concepts, and even the people that go into making up Sheikh Uthman and Fodi as we know him, they took a different turn as they were doing Islamic scholarship. So you have scholars who are looking at the political realities. You have scholars that are looking at how does the religion itself in specific, how does the the juristic tradition, how does it guide the community to address issues of literacy, issues of corruption, issues of growth and development. So that's but a beginning point, because the question, for instance, transatlantic slavery, which eventually has a massive impact on the Caribbean and then on North America, is very much tied into what was going on in what they called the jihad movements. Paul Lovejoy, he labeled them the jihad movements versus the revolutions that were taking place in Europe. So the revolutions were taking place in Europe at the same time that these jihad movements were taking place. Yes. And in that same frame of time, not uh, being exacting, you have Napoleon going into Egypt. So the Muslims are encountering the beginning of imperialism coming from the West. And our people in the Americas are addressing imperialism and addressing questions of how do you consider uh, the human being and the social order and so on and so forth. So that type of questioning begins to take place in West Africa based on injustices like Ahmed Baba, he's taken as a slave. And so he's forced to question, can a Muslim enslave another Muslim? Is slavery and blackness a necessary relationship? Like he's dealing with that type of question. And again, you find that the scholarship that's behind Sheikh Uthman and Fodi is dealing with the idea of the just leader, the idea of economic justice, these types of things. So all of those questions are prioritized in that scholarship, but they're not complete. So the West African, the West African tradition is a starting point, but a lot of those questions are addressed in many ways more completely within our experience, right? But the West African tradition begins that. The other thing that comes in is that both the West African tradition and the Andalusian tradition are very much tied to one another. And the difference that, or the unique feature, is that there's a civilizational dynamic that comes along with those traditions. It's not it's not just a spiritualized uh learning of Islam, so to speak, right? And this is what you begin to see in people like Al Bisu and others. Like the Puerto Rican reality is very unique in that The revolutionaries in Puerto Rico, they probably were the first PhDs in the Western Hemisphere. And when you look at someone like Albizu, he's interdisciplinary. So that's the type of like there's a continuity with that type of religiosity that is an interdisciplinary investigation to faith and life. And so you have that same you have those types of overlaps in the Americas, right? Even the same thing with the types of questions that they begin to ask. You have those same questions being asked in the Americas. So there's a lineage of continuity with that. Not to mention that Uthman and Fodi's students end up being taken as prisoners of war, and they're the ones that are launching the uprisings and the revolution, and eventually they contribute to the maroon societies or cimarron tradition in the Americas. So part of the uprisings also were inspired by the teachings of Uthman and Fodi, and that's historically and archaeologically uh uncovered. Is not something that is not a it's not so it's not just a an anecdotal note. You know what I'm saying? There's archaeological evidence, there's documents, there's studies even in Cuba in this regard, and there's pointing things pointing to Puerto Rico by Sylvie and Jove, and they discovered some documents in Jamaica, and then we know the reality of Brazil. There's a lot of work that has been done in Brazil. So that tradition is very much tied into our culture, whether we like it or not. In how it is that there's certain emphases given to particular concepts like liberation and justice